Okay, we're recording. So, welcome to this video. We are recording two videos. The first one and this one is going to be focusing on aided language stimulation. And then we're going to record a second video, which is going to go on a wee bit and talk about POD as the system. So we will split it into two videos. Some of you might just want to watch this one, the first one about aided language stimulation. And some of you might also be ready to watch the second video, which talks more about POD, which is the book, the communication book. Before we just start, we'll quickly introduce ourselves because we are just faces on a screen at the moment. So my name's Sarah Gallagher and I'm a speech and language therapist. I'm based usually at the Pines in Inverness, and obviously right now I'm at home. And this is Katrina.
I'm Katrina Hopkins, and I'm also a speech and language therapist and normally based at the Pines. And I'm beaming in from my caravan today. So I'm glad that everyone's getting a chance to kind of get a little bit of information about some of the things that we normally talk to people face to face about. So I hope this is useful.
Okay, so just a little bit about what we are hoping to cover today. The aims really of this first session are for everybody watching just to get a better understanding of what we mean when we say aided language. So what do we mean? What is aided language and what are we talking about when we say that? And also really to increase your confidence in knowing how to support a learner who's using aided language. So it might be your child or a child that lives in your house or a child that's in your family. You know, any learner who's using aided language, we want you to feel confident how to support them. So those are really the aims of this first session. We will just start then, I think, talking a little bit about how we learn language, how language learning works. And really the short answer to that is language learning works through immersion. So a wee example of that to help you understand that and maybe something that you would understand in your life is thinking about maybe anybody who's watching this, if you've ever tried to learn a second language. And I think most of us probably at school would have had exposure to a second language. Maybe you have learned a second language in a different way. And I wonder if some of us watching this have remained fluent in a second language. And if you have remained fluent in a second language, just have a little think right now about, was that through going to weekly lessons, just learning that way? And probably usually when we do this little session in a room of people, we ask people to put their hands up who has learned a second language. And most people will put their hand up and say, yeah, I've had a stab at that. And then when we ask who's still fluent, most of the hands will go down. And the people that are still fluent in a second language, when we ask them how they learned that, it's always through immersion in that language. So they've either gone to live in a country where they've spoken the second language, or they've grown up in a household where that language has been spoken. They've gone to work somewhere, and that's the language that's been spoken. So it's always through immersion, really, that people are able to become fluent in that second language. And really, the same is the case for first language learning. So if you're thinking about, a good way to think about it is a baby who's hearing language from before they're born even. They'll only really begin to use language expressively from about age one. So if you think about a little baby, we're talking to them from, as I said, before they're born, they're hearing language and they're hearing song, they're hearing chat. And then once they're born, we talk to them non-stop really for months and months and months and months. We talk to them about anything and everything. We comment on things that are going on around us. They're hearing lots and lots of language. some of it aimed at them in that kind of baby talk, and a lot of it probably just happening incidentally around them, and people are chatting about things that are going on. However, we don't have any expectation on that baby to use any language. I mean, we'll talk to them, and then they come out with maybe one word at around 12 to 18 months, and we're thinking, yes, this is amazing. We're delighted with that one word. We haven't expected anything from them up until that point. So they have had the perfect situation in that they've been immersed in a language with no expectation on them to say anything expressively for a long, long time. So that's in a nutshell how language learning works. If we think about children who are not developing language skills typically, or they're not responding to that way of learning verbal spoken language, they're not responding to speech alone, we need to think about other ways that we can provide that kind of immersion for them. So we need to think about additional methods alongside just our spoken language so that they can access language and access meaning. And really, that's what we're talking about when we talk about aided language. That's what we would mean. We mean something over and above just our spoken language alone, for children to manage to get some meaning. Because of that, then, we need to think about how we are communicating with children who perhaps need some aided language. So when we thought about the situation with the baby, we were talking and talking and talking and talking for a year or more. And what that baby then did, what their output was after all that time, was speech. So they had speech in, and then after all that time and that immersion, speech came out. They had speech as their output. So if we only use speech as the input method for a learner who's not responding to that on its own, who's needing something additional, some additional method to communicate, to understand and to express themselves, if we only give them speech in, the only possible output that we can expect from them, because it's all they've been exposed to, is speech. So that's all they've had, been exposed to, and therefore that's really the only thing they've got a chance of using. But if we know they're going to struggle with that, if we know that they've not been responding to that in the same way that we maybe expected, we need to think about what we're doing in terms of what input we're giving them. So if we, as the people immersing them in language, if we use a mixture maybe of speech, we might use some signs, like some Makaton signs or some other gestures, and some aided language. If we think their speech is not going to develop typically, then they have the opportunity to use signs, symbols, or aided language as their output because they've been exposed to it. They've had that immersion in different methods, not just speech alone. And that's probably one of the most important points just to think about, because it's really up to us to think about the input that we're giving in, and it has to match the output that we would expect and hope for from that child. So if you think about maybe just an example to think about this to make it make sense, is if we decided, I really want to learn Japanese, I'm really, really interested in learning Japanese, I'm going to go along to night classes, and that's how I'm going to learn it. So if you went along to Japanese and the teacher said, okay, great, everyone's here to learn Japanese, but she kept going back to speak in English, because everybody in the room spoke English and that was maybe her primary language, and she'd give you a little bit of Japanese but kept going back, we just wouldn't learn it. We wouldn't learn Japanese. There's no way. And it's the same for learners who are needing to learn aided language. If we speak a little bit, maybe now and then using some aided language, but keep going back to spoken English, we can't expect them to ever learn their aided language. So we, as the adults in the child's life, have to provide an environment where they are getting the best possible exposure to symbols. Um, and I know sometimes that can be really tricky because you've got so many other things to do and you think, well, I'll do those symbols in the evening, or I'll quickly do a little bit of symbol stuff for 10 minutes. And that a lot of the time is maybe where we think we will start, or that's what maybe we can manage. But really, having the symbols in the house, or just having them around, having a communication book, even just having it in the house or having it in the environment isn't enough, really. What's important is the use of that system. So if it's sitting kind of, and this happens lots and lots and lots, Katrina and I have seen this happening lots, is that we'll decide that symbols are going to help maybe a child, and we'll put that in place, and it kind of gets used intermittently, and sometimes ends up in a drawer or in a cupboard, and that's really, really common. But the reality is, just having it there isn't going to make the difference. It's about us as the people, the adults around that child, using it with them, and that is what's going to enable communication development to happen. So that's really what the key is here. And this is what's known as aided language stimulation, basically. Or sometimes you might hear us calling it modeling language. So those are maybe the two terms you might hear us talking about. And that's what we mean. We mean using the child's system with them, giving them the input that we want to see them use as output. So making sure that we're giving them lots of exposure to the language, and trying to replicate as much as we can that immersion in language that a baby will have, but we need to try and replicate for them using aided language. So at this point, you might want to pause this video, and we're going to provide a couple of links to some YouTube videos that we think are just really helpful. This one that you're going to watch first, it's only a minute long. I think it's just over a minute. And it's of a wee girl called Harper. Her mum is using Pod at it's an aided language display as part of the Pod system. And she's using aided language with her at a very, very early stage. So you can see that Harper in the video is really just starting to kind of explore aided language. And you can see that her mum is using modeling. So when a symbol is pointed to, mum is responding to that. So if you pause here, go and watch the video for a minute or so, and then come back and we can have another chat about it. Okay. So if you've just watched the video of Harper, you'll see that Harper is exploring that aided language display. She's looking at some of the symbols. She's occasionally maybe pointing to a couple. And when she's doing that, what her mum is doing is labeling the symbol that she's pointed to. So her mum is giving her the verbal label to what she's pointed to. So a lot of the time it's over and over. It's hello, hello, I love you, those kinds of things. And that really is all we are expecting, the type of interaction that we're expecting you to be able to do at this stage. So it's about saying the label while speaking. And please don't be worried or anxious about it. I know it seems like this is a big system and it's new and it's something that you might be anxious about, but really, if we think about it, it's just pointing to symbols while you're talking. So you can see that Harper's mum is allowing Harper to really just explore what's on the page, and she is labeling those symbols for her. So Harper probably is not at this point intentionally choosing any of these ones. She's probably pointing and thinking, I wonder what's going to happen if I point to this one. I don't know what this means, but I wonder what's going to happen here. What's going to happen? What's mum going to say? And mum is actually just providing that meaning onto what she's pointing to. So it's very, very similar in how a child would learn verbal language, except they've got that visual back up there. They've got that visual display to aid the language learning. So you don't need to point to a symbol for every single word that you say. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about, oh, I have to point to lots and lots and lots all the time while I'm talking. You can think just about pointing to the key word or words that would make sense for what you're talking about, and point to those just while speaking normally. So if you're talking to your child about cars, and your child is really into cars, and you have a couple of symbols maybe about that on your language display, and you want to say, oh, wow, look at that fast car. You might only point to the car one when you're getting started, and that's absolutely fine. A key word would be car. And as you go on, you might start to point to two or more, but one word, key word at a time is absolutely fine to support your natural spoken language. It will feel really probably slow and cumbersome when you get started. It will maybe feel unnatural. It might not feel part of your natural communication. Please don't worry and be reassured that that's absolutely fine. Going slow and slowing yourself down and being forced almost to slow down is actually, in a lot of ways, a good thing, because for a lot of the children that we will be using aided language with, it's probably a good pace for them, actually, a good processing pace for a lot of the learners using aided language. It gives them a chance to process the verbal language, but also to keep track of what you're pointing to, and to process that the language they're hearing and the symbol that they're seeing have the same meaning. So it will feel slow, and you might not feel particularly natural using it initially, but please be reassured that everybody's felt like that when we first start using it, and it's absolutely fine. So I'm just going to pull up on the screen now an aided language display. What I mean by that is a page. It's usually an A4 page of some symbols. So we've talked about aided language and aided language stimulation. Another phrase that you might hear us talking about is ALD, or aided language display. And this is what we mean when we're talking about that. I'll pull up a page, and it's just a page of symbols. And you might want to, I'll talk through some of it, and then after that you might want to just pause the video and have a little look at it yourself, and have a think about how you might use it. So this is an aided language display around just general interaction. There's some vocabulary, like there's the vocabulary for I, or do, or I do, or me, asking a question, more, some opinions, I like this and don't like this, finish, uh-oh, I want something, I don't know, go, or I want to go, stop, and something's wrong. So you can see that some of this vocabulary, well, most of this vocabulary would just be general stuff you would be using in a chat, or in an interaction with a child. You will be able to get lots of messages across using this. So if you were chatting with a child and you were using this to model your own language, you'd be able to say, oh, I really like this, or oh, I think this is finished. Or if the child drops something or you drop something, you can say, uh-oh, oh, I think you want to go somewhere, or let's go somewhere. Oh, I think something's wrong. Those kinds of messages. So I'm going to pause. You can pause the video if you want to. I'll leave this up on, you can pause it so this is up on the screen, and feel free to have a think about maybe some of the ways you might want to use a general aided language display like this one. So you can pause now. and I'll hand over to Katrina.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about just kind of getting started with aided language. So maybe you've had a chat with a speech and language therapist about your child's communication, and aided language has been mentioned as a strategy. And you're just, I guess, at a point of feeling like, okay, where do we go from here, really? So as Sarah already mentioned, I think one of the things that's really nice about aided language stimulation is that from the child's point of view, there are no prerequisite skills. We're not expecting a child to have achieved something or proven a skill before we would introduce a strategy like aided language stimulation. For many children, they may not even look at or acknowledge the symbols that are being used with them as we're doing that thing. But this is okay, and I think that that's a really important point, that we don't need to necessarily kind of worry about that to begin with, because, as we said already, we're not expecting that kind of expressive use of the system by the child. Just as with our, typically developing baby, we're not expecting them to start speaking immediately, or with a child learning a new language, we wouldn't expect them to start speaking it as soon as they begin to be exposed to it. And we can't know how long it will take, how long this us doing lots and lots of the kind of input modelling, lots of the aided language, before the child begins to use that system themselves expressively. And we realise that's hard. That's, we would love to have a crystal ball and be able to predict how long it will take. But what we need to try and think about is just that we need to keep providing lots of opportunities for the system to be used, keep doing the modelling, and just, try and remain, I suppose, open in terms of our expectations about when something might happen in terms of expressive use. And there's, I guess, I think one of the analogies that I've heard that I felt was quite useful was that for some children, they might be a bit like a kind of second language learner. So they might be a child who already has an understanding of spoken language. So they may not be using language expressively, but they may actually understand some of the language that they're hearing in their environment. And so when we introduce aided language stimulation, what they're effectively doing is mapping the kind of language of the symbols onto an already established understanding of language. So that's almost like a kind of second language learner. Some children might be more like a first language learner. And so that would be a child who doesn't yet appear to have an understanding of the spoken language that they're hearing in the environment around them. And so for them, they're needing to learn what all these symbols are, but they're also needing to learn what these concepts are. So for example, if we were pointing to the symbol for more and saying the word more, for that child, they may actually be needing to learn what more means in really meaningful, situations that are happening kind of naturally throughout their day. So more juice, more snack, more toys, more bricks. So lots of opportunities to hear the language, have the experience, and see the symbols being used all together. So that's a bit like a kind of first language learner. And for those children, it might take longer for them to begin to use the system expressively. Not necessarily, but that can sometimes be the case. And I guess there's another analogy which I found quite helpful, which was, I guess, the idea about, just putting in the kind of groundwork that's what we're effectively doing by doing aided language stimulation with children or with learners, that we're putting in the kind of the building blocks for language development for them. And if you think about that story of the three little pigs, where there's the kind of house of straw or twigs, which can be kind of knocked up in not much time at all, but actually doesn't really stand the test of time in that story, compared to the house of bricks, which, takes a lot more work. There's a lot more groundwork that's had to go into that. The process takes much longer, but actually, as a sort of really solid foundation, a really solid structure, it proves that it's able to stand the test of time. And I think if we think of language learning as being like that, we're putting in all the input, which feels hard work often, and we really appreciate that when we're supporting families, that it's a lot of work alongside what what you're already having to fit in to life, but actually putting in the kind of groundwork to lead to that really sort of solid structure is going to have a much better long-term effect. Okay, when we think back to that video that we saw of Harper, and Sarah already touched on this a little, when children begin to start showing an interest in the symbols, so they might begin looking at it, looking at the symbols, looking at you as you're pointing to the symbols, they then might go on to pointing to the symbols. And that's kind of the stage that Harper was at. And it can appear completely random. As with Harper, she seemed to just be kind of thinking, oh, I wonder what will happen when I point to this symbol. And I think we tend to think of that as being a little bit like babbling in typically developing communicators, that there's a point where something is developing in the way of language, but it's not got meaning. And actually, what we do with typically developing infants who are beginning to babble is that we assign meaning. Really, we begin to make it meaningful for the child by responding to their babbling and turning that into an interaction. When a little one begins to say "dada," for example, and everyone jumps up for joy and says, "Oh, my baby said daddy." They maybe didn't say daddy at that point in time, but because we did lots and lots of jumping up and down, yes, this is daddy, right? Oh, you said daddy. That provided meaning for the child. If we think of that kind of random pointing as being like babbling, that can help us kind of understand that stage in the process for children who are using these aided language systems. And I think the point, I suppose, about giving that kind of input with open expectations is that we're not necessarily, we're not expecting anything back initially, and that we're not using the system to kind of teach or to test or to kind of expect responses. And part of the reason for that is that if a child has a system used with them that they feel under pressure to give an answer to a question or use it when they don't yet fully understand it, it actually won't be meaningful or valuable to them. It's probably something that will just feel like, oh no, this is something that gets pulled out and I have to do this work. so we try and encourage people to kind of think of modeling, almost kind of kid speak, modeling the types of things that your child might want to say if they could, so that it's not just about it being used to kind of give instructions. It's about using it to help them feel that their kind of voice is being heard. So as Sarah said, the kind of aided language displays, those single pages that we just saw, are a really, really great starting place when it comes to using aided language stimulation. They can come in a variety of sizes, physical sizes in terms of kind of, A4 typically, but potentially smaller. But also there can be a number of different symbols on a page. So you might have kind of 9 or 12, or you might have maybe more like 20 or more. You could have, many, many more than that. But for many children, 20 is a kind of a good upper limit to begin with. And you can use them in a variety of different ways. So that one that Sarah showed earlier, the kind of chat page, is one that can be really nice for just having with you all the time. It can be used for modeling throughout the day because it's not really activity specific, the vocabulary, the kind of uh-oh and finished and I like this and more. that's the kind of vocabulary, as Sarah said, that kind of happens throughout the day. So there's lots of opportunities to use that vocabulary in a variety of situations to make the vocabulary meaningful. Another way of doing it can be to use the kind of aided language stimulation, use those displays within specific activities. We sometimes call them activity displays. They might be ones where you've got a specific activity set up, something like bubbles or Play-Doh or toy cars, and there's vocabulary that's specific to that activity that you can then use within that. Every time the child likes to play with their toy cars, for example, you could be pulling out that page or keeping it close to where the toy cars are kept. And within your normal play that you're doing, those kind of special moments that you get where you can just sit down on the floor and be involved in the activity with the child, then you can be doing the modelling of different vocabulary within that activity. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly share my screen and show you a couple of different examples. And again, you may wish to just press pause and you can kind of spend a bit longer just having a wee fiddle around with it. So this first one should be sharing now, hopefully. So this first one is, it's got 16 symbols on a page, and this is for bath time. And I think this is a really nice one actually, because it can be laminated and just stuck on the wall right by the bath. And actually a lot of the vocabulary that, of course, that we use in this situation, uh-oh, you splashed me, I'm wet now, oh, we need more soap, the water's finished now, it's time to get out. Loads and loads of the things that we would be saying normally within that kind of activity that are just already there. Makes it way easier for us because we don't have to kind of think about adding in anything extra. But there's lots and lots of opportunities. Something like bath time that's happening fairly regularly. There's lots of chances to be able to kind of practice that vocabulary. So if you want to, you can pause that and kind of spend a bit of time just having a wee play around with doing some modelling yourself. I'm going to stop sharing now, and then I might go on to another one. Back to us briefly, and then I'll have a wee look at another one. Okay, so this one that I'm just about to show you is for blocks. So again, lots of vocabulary that you would use in an activity doing blocks. Construction with a child are already there. So building blocks and knocking them down, that's the main crux of it. Are you going to do a tall tower or a short tower? Are you going to build a wall? So a lot of the vocabulary is there to be able to, as Sarah said earlier, do a single kind of point to a single symbol within the phrase that you're saying. So something like you might point to the symbol for knock it down, but you might have actually said, oh my goodness, it's your turn to knock it down. But you might just point to that one symbol. Or there might be times where you feel actually that you're getting a wee bit kind of more confident with it, and you can begin to combine 2 symbols or 3 symbols. So you might say, yeah, I'm going to put it on the wall. And you could point to the symbol for put and the symbol for wall. Or I'm going to have another block. So I, and then another and block. So you can combine even 3 within just the small number of symbols that you've got there. So those are just a few examples of some of the aided language displays. And we've got loads and loads of different ones that are already kind of pre-made, and also we can make up ones for people which can be useful as well. I'm going to come back out of there. Okay, so aided language displays, I guess, are a really nice starting point, as I say, for helping get aided language stimulation kind of up and running for people, and to give families a bit of confidence with just getting going with it. But sometimes it can feel like it's time to just move on from just the sort of single aided language displays. Often when people get to a point where they've got a whole folder of individual pages, then we tend to feel that actually something more is needed. I guess a couple of the drawbacks about sticking only with aided language displays is that we are continuing to maintain all the control within the interaction. So we're setting limits, I suppose, of where the conversation can go. It's confined within that aided language display. And it also means that, of course, if you've got the word, you've maybe learned the word squash because you've been doing a Play-Doh activity and it's got the word squash in it. What would happen if you were out and about and you were perhaps your child wanted to jump up and down on a molehill, for example. That's something that I think a lot of children like to do, and you want to use that word squash, but now that vocabulary is at home with the Play-Doh equipment. It's not available to you. So sometimes people like to think about how they can begin to use aided language in a much kind of bigger way and more, access to more language within a bigger communication system. And so one of the communication systems that aided language is used as a strategy for is the system known as POD. So what we're going to do now is we're going to finish this bit of training, and I hope that for those of you who are using or beginning to use aided language, this has been helpful, and we're going to go on and talk about POD as our next session.